Opening the center immediately establishes central pawn presence, contesting crucial squares for piece development and future maneuvering. Developing a knight towards the center immediately signals an intention to contest the king's pawn territory and prepare for rapid peace activity. Developing the bishop aggressively opens lines and contests the center, but it also exposes the piece early. Establishing central presence and challenging white's ambitious bishop are the immediate goals, creating dynamic pawn tension. Solidifying the center and preparing development, but relinquishing some of the central presence gained earlier. Challenging white's central pawn structure opens up diagonal lines and forces immediate tactical decisions regarding pawn exchanges. Capturing the pawn opens the d-file, potentially creating attacking opportunities for your pieces later. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight activates a piece and prepares to contest the center. Pressing the knight is a tactical provocation, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain initiative. Forcefully diverting the white bishop, this immediate check creates tactical skirmishes and disrupts white's pawn structure. Securing the knight's advanced position, this move challenges black's queen, forcing it to reveal its intentions while reinforcing white's central presence and preparing for potential pawn structure adjustments. Black reinforces the pawn on c5 and prepares to castle kingside, a solid developing step that avoids immediate complications. Securing the bishop from any immediate harassment and preventing black's queen from establishing an oppressive presence on the a5 square. This maneuver subtly begins to contest the queenside while preparing for potential pawn advances. This maneuver immediately injects dynamism by targeting the bishop, forcing white into a reactive posture and disrupting their planned pawn recapture, potentially leading to an open file for black's rook. Seeking to untangle the knight from its aggressive foray, white opts to reposition, acknowledging the potential for tactical disruptions while aiming to solidify its own central presence and prepare for queenside development. Sacrificing central influence for tactical disruption, this exchange opens critical diagonals and potentially weakens white's pawn structure, aiming to leverage the initiative gained by the bishop's earlier sortie. Recapturing with the knight untangles the queenside, activating a piece that was previously pinned and preparing to challenge black's central pawn majority, while simultaneously reinforcing white's central control. Developing the bishop to a solid square prepares for castling and connects the rooks, a vital step in coordinating your army for the middle game. Launching an aggressive queenside pawn push, white aims to exploit the slightly misplaced black queen and gain significant space, potentially forcing a retreat or a concession of material. Releasing pressure on the queenside, this retreat concedes the initiative on the queenside, but aims to untangle black's awkwardly placed pieces. The queen now seeks a safer haven, potentially eyeing the central squares or preparing for a pawn recapture. Securing the monarch amid this developing skirmish is a prudent decision, bringing the king to safety and preparing the rook for potential action on the central files. Securing the monarch in the corner provides immediate defensive stability, a prudent decision given the slightly compromised central pawn structure. This sidesteps potential tactical complications and allows for continued piece development towards the center. This quiet repositioning of the queen aims to achieve several subtle objectives simultaneously. It prepares the deployment of the queen's rook to the d-file, potentially reinforcing the center and pressuring black's pawn structure, while also creating a defensive screen for the king on the kingside, should the need arise for it to seek refuge there. Furthermore, by vacating the d2 square, it potentially opens avenues for other pieces to utilize that central square or the adjacent files more effectively in the future. Developing the bishop to this active square now aims to contest the central influence and prepare for potential breakthroughs, though it does concede some central control for the moment. A bold attempt to seize control of the e7 square, implicitly challenging black's king's safety and the integrity of its pawn structure, while also preparing to potentially exploit the open c-file. Releasing the pinned knight from the defense of the e6 pawn allows white's bishop to exert more pressure on the kingside, potentially setting up a future attack on the weakened dark squares. positioning a rook on the semi-open b. File aims to challenge black's queenside control and prepare for potential pawn pushes later in the game. Instead of passively observing the development of white's queen's rook on the b-file, black's bishop repositions to d7, seeking to bolster the central pawn structure and potentially prepare for future pawn advances. This subtle repositioning aims to enhance the coordination of black's pieces, especially the knights, while simultaneously challenging white's ambitious pawn push on the queenside by offering a piece sacrifice that, if accepted, would open lines for black's minor pieces. Reconnecting the knight to the queenside, this maneuver aims to reinforce the a3 pawn and prepare for potential expansion on the flank, while simultaneously bringing another defender back into the fold to support the central pawn structure. A subtle but important repositioning to maintain flexibility. Black boldly challenges white's queenside structure, aiming to pry open lines and activate pieces. This pawn push disrupts the comfortable b4 pawn and forces white to confront the potential weaknesses it creates, while simultaneously seeking to unburden the cramped knight on c6. Confronting the pawn chain directly aims to fracture black's queenside pawn structure and open lines for white's rooks, potentially liberating the queen's bishop. Challenging the pawn structure, black seizes the opportunity to disrupt white's queenside solidity and open lines for their own pieces. This exchange creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces white to commit to a response, potentially revealing weaknesses or strategic intentions. The pawn chain on the queenside now aggressively advances, aiming to solidify white's central space advantage and restrict black's minor pieces. Embracing the gambit, black immediately seeks to exploit the slightly exposed d-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially gain rapid piece activity in return for the material. This proactive approach sacrifices immediate material for dynamic counterplay. White recaptures the pawn, aiming to consolidate material while simultaneously creating potential pressure along the c-file. The bishop's repositioning to c4 exerts influence over black's queenside and can be a launching pad for further aggressive play or a strategic retreat if needed, effectively challenging black's pawn structure and seeking to exploit any weaknesses that arise from the recent exchanges. Seeking to activate its passive knight, black injects dynamism into the center, challenging white's well-placed bishop and creating a fork threat on the c3 knight, aiming to unravel white's queenside pawn structure and generate counterplay. Gaining breathing room for the queen after the knight's foray, the bishop retreats to a more stable diagonal, aiming to influence the center and potentially support a future kingside advance, while the material count remains balanced and both sides eye the open d-file. Initiating a counterthrust towards white's somewhat exposed queenside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and potentially open lines for black's more active bishop. The dark-squared bishop now eyes the c-file and can participate in the battle for central influence, forcing white to consider defensive adjustments rather than purely offensive plans. This proactive approach questions the soundness of white's current piece deployment. Opening the central d-file presents a direct challenge to black's control, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on d5 and disrupt black's unified pawn structure. The queen's retreat to d8 and subsequent a5 maneuvering by black seems to have been a tactical miscalculation, leaving white with improved piece activity and a more harmonious setup after the dust settles. The present action seeks to capitalize on this imbalance by immediately claiming a key open highway for white's rooks. The knight's daring leap to c4 immediately injects tactical chaos into the position, threatening to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and eyeing the vulnerable b2 square. This move fundamentally questions white's central control and forces a sharp recalculation of defensive resources, as the e3 pawn is now under significant strain. Sacrificing the bishop to eliminate a key defender opens up the kingside for a potential assault. This exchange immediately alters the dynamic, clearing the path for your knights to potentially become more active. Notice how black's queen is now somewhat misplaced after its previous adventures. The immediate threat is no longer the bishop on c4, but rather the ensuing tactical possibilities that this piece removal enables. Consider how this concession of material fundamentally changes the strategic landscape, demanding a precise follow-up to capitalize on the created imbalance. The weakened pawn structure around the black king becomes a tempting target. Black reclaims the pawn, but at the cost of activating white's bishop and solidifying control of the central squares with the d-pawn. This move, 21, bxc4, represents a significant positional concession. By capturing the pawn, black has handed white a valuable tempo and allowed the white bishop to find a strong outpost on c4. White's pieces are now coordinating beautifully, with the knight on e2 poised to join the attack and the queen ready to redeploy. Black's bishop now finds itself somewhat misplaced, and the subsequent struggle will likely revolve around defending the weakened kingside and preventing white from exploiting the central space advantage. The dynamic balance has shifted, creating opportunities for white to exert sustained pressure. Focusing on the open c-file, white immediately re-engages the critical diagonal, seeking to leverage the increased piece activity by clearing a path for the queen. Reasserting the bishop's presence on the long diagonal, bb5 immediately challenges the knight's comfortable outpost and aims to disrupt white's control over the central dark squares, forcing a decision on how to address this active piece. The bishop's retreat to e5 is an interesting positional sacrifice, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses on the queen side for a later kingside attack. White's piece activity is currently a bit uncoordinated, but this maneuver could initiate a clearer plan by forcing black to react and potentially weakening their central control. It might be a gambit for initiative, hoping that black's structural concessions will outweigh the material advantage gained in the long run. This maneuver unpins the bishop, sacrificing positional clarity for immediate tactical probing, hoping to exploit the slight disarray in white's queenside pawns by activating the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal. Sacrificing the exchange, white initiates a transition to a simplified endgame, aiming to exploit the bishop pair's potential while black's queen has become a bit exposed. This decision likely stems from a positional assessment, believing the subsequent pawn structure and remaining pieces will favor white despite the material deficit. The immediate consequence is the removal of a critical attacking piece for black, simplifying the tactical landscape and opening avenues for white's remaining pieces. It's a calculated risk, prioritizing long-term positional advantages over immediate material equality. Black recaptures the bishop, but in doing so relinquishes a critical central pawn and opens the file for white's rook, potentially creating a dangerous outpost. While retrieving the piece feels natural, the broader positional landscape now favors white's ability to exploit open lines and pressure black's king. The immediate recapture sacrifices long-term structural integrity for a short-term material gain, which might prove costly as the game progresses into a more open position. The exchange on e8 decisively clears the path for the rook, initiating a pawnless endgame where piece activity and controlled advancement become paramount. The exchange of queens precipitates a stark endgame where the exposed black king, despite its apparent safety behind pawns, will soon feel the pressure from white's connected rooks and bishop pair, especially as the central files begin to open. The rook now aims to reclaim the vital open c-file, a critical pathway to potentially pressure black's isolated pawn on c4 and disrupt their piece coordination. Executing this exchange offers black a welcomed simplification, eliminating a rather imposing bishop from white's attacking setup, though it does concede control of the newly opened central files to the opponent. The exchange on the c-file removes a key defender of the d4 pawn, creating a lasting weakness that white might exploit in the coming endgame. Unlocking the open c-file, black aims to activate their rook, creating potential pressure along this newly liberated highway while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial central squares. The pawn pushes forward, a bold attempt to reclaim the initiative and challenge the bishop's central presence, although it does open a diagonal for the enemy king to potentially exploit later. Seeking to redeploy its bishop to a more active square and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Safeguarding the monarch from lurking threats and preparing for eventual king activity across the board. Consolidating the king's position offers much-needed safety after a series of exchanges, preparing for potential pawn pushes and piece maneuvering in the simplified, yet still complex, endgame. Instantly asserting central dominion and activating the knight, This maneuver aims to disrupt black's nascent coordination and potentially create weaknesses around the enemy king. Centering the king is a fundamental endgame principle, and 30. Key 7 actively pursues this goal, bringing the monarch into the fray to support its remaining forces and contest central squares. The white monarch cautiously advances, seeking sanctuary from the open files while simultaneously preparing to participate in the endgame skirmishes. Unlocking the open file, this rook now aggressively probes the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the enemy camp. Preserving the rook's active placement on the second rank, this maneuver aims to improve its defensive posture and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, reinforcing the overall structural integrity against black's surprisingly mobile bishop. Consolidating the king's safety becomes paramount as the endgame approaches. This move strategically repositions the monarch away from the open b-file and potential future threats emanating from white's rook and knight. Activating the monarch on the central squares now offers greater mobility, opening up possibilities for king participation in the endgame action and potential pawn advances. The black king steps forward, seeking the relative safety of the queenside's open spaces and aiming to become a more active participant in the unfolding endgame, a bold gambit given the exposed white rook. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside may seem aggressive, but it risks weakening the king's shelter by opening lines to its defender, potentially creating long-term structural vulnerabilities. Unleashing the rook onto the newly opened first rank, this maneuver immediately challenges white's king's safety and aims to disrupt the delicate pawn structure white has painstakingly built. It forces a reaction, either by reinforcing the king's shelter or by ceding valuable central space, potentially creating new avenues for black's remaining pieces to penetrate. The g5 pawn push boldly advances, seeking to pry open the kingside and create attacking chances by disrupting black's pawn structure. The exchange of these bishops fundamentally simplifies the position, steering the game towards an endgame where black's active king might become a significant asset, but white's pawns on the kingside now gain potential mobility. The monarch emerges from its sheltered position, venturing into the fray to seize a vital outpost and disrupt black's pawn structure. Unleashing the rook to the first rank creates immediate havoc, forcing the white king into a compromised square and opening up pathways for further penetration with the king now awkwardly exposed. Unleashing the king in the endgame, the monarch bravely steps forward, a bold maneuver aiming to seize central influence and potentially threaten the isolated black pawn. The black monarch, now venturing from its protective shield, steps directly into a pawn-infested minefield, its central exposure a glaring vulnerability that white's unified pieces will surely exploit. A bold push to centralize the pawn structure, daringly opening lines towards the king's safety in the ensuing endgame battle. Bringing the monarch closer to the action, this advance aims to support the rook's activity on the d-file and potentially usher the king towards the queenside, creating a more active endgame presence. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside is a dynamic attempt to liberate white's rook and create potential infiltration squares, potentially forcing black's king into a more exposed position or opening lines for counterplay. The king marches forward, seeking refuge amidst the reduced pawn structure and open files, a daring maneuver aiming to support the remaining pieces and potentially participate in attacking the opponent's kingside. Unleashing the pawn storm, white ignites the kingside, aiming to shatter black's defenses and open lines for the monarch, forcing a crucial defensive posture. Forks the king and rook, forcing a painful concession that opens up the king's defenses further. White forces a critical pawn capture, opening a path for the king to become a more active piece in the ensuing endgame. Exposing the king to further threats by opening the g-file after the capture, this move concedes a critical positional concession in the ensuing endgame, where pawn structure becomes paramount and the king's safety diminishes significantly. The king's exposed position demands immediate attention as it bravely ventures toward the queenside, a risky gambit given the open files, where its royal brethren usually find solace in closed positions or behind a fortress of pawns. The white king, exposed and isolated on the queenside after the exchange of rooks, is now facing immediate threats from black's rook and knight coordination. The monarch's retreat to g4 signals a shift towards king activity, a common theme when queens are off the board and pawns begin their march forward. Sacrificing the pawn, black opens up the king's escape route and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, hoping to create counterplay against the exposed monarch. The king's sudden exposure demands immediate attention, as the pawn's advance opens up a crucial diagonal for white's monarch. A desperate attempt to snag a tempo and perhaps expose the opposing king, though the king is already quite secure, and this pawn push ultimately simplifies the position further in white's favor. The white king, abandoning safety, marches forward, a bold decision that gambles on the pawn's power to shield itself. The rook's triumphant return to the action creates an immediate king hunt, exploiting the open files and the severely compromised defensive structure around white's monarch. The monarch's exposed position now becomes the focal point as the rook is unleashed. The king's desperate flight path, now cut off by the advancing pawn, faces an immediate check that offers a flicker of hope in this grim position. The monarch's final refuge is precariously exposed as the rook bears down, a desperate attempt to find sanctuary from the encroaching opposition. The rook's retreat to c5 now targets the isolated pawn on a3, a potential weak point to exploit in the coming endgame.